Welcome back to today's episode of the Healthy Shift Worker podcast. I'm your host, Audra Starkey. Now, before we launch into the episode, I want to first make mention that I'm thrilled to announce the release of our brand new program, the Circadian Lifestyle Program, exclusively for shift workers. And I have to say, this is my most important course to date, as it focuses on an area of human biology that is not really spoken about within the wellness space, yet it is profoundly important and relevant for shift workers, that being circadian biology, which is essentially all about timing. The course has been handcrafted by myself to help you to minimise further disruption to your body's innate timing mechanism, aka your circadian rhythm or biological clock, which essentially controls every aspect of our biology. So it is super, super important. The course is really aiming to help you to improve your overall health, really focusing on things like the quality of your sleep, reducing gut disturbances, improving mental well-being, including the implementation of circadian eating to enhance our weight loss. So if you want to join other shift workers on this journey to better health and wellbeing, tailored specifically to the unique challenges of shift work, you can access the course. It is available through our new Healthy Shift Worker School membership site for just $30 Australian dollars per month. If you want more information to join the community, just check out the link in the show notes. Now, moving on to today's episode, our guest is Zaid Dahhaj from California in the USA, who featured previously on the podcast in episode 112 and is very passionate about all things circadian biology. Today's conversation stems around raising awareness around some of the misconceptions and dangers around sun exposure and skin cancer, especially given its integral role in regulating the circadian rhythm and all our circadian clocks, which are located in pretty much every tissue, cell and organ within the body. It also shines a light on making us question a little more about testing for vitamin D, given it's just a proxy marker for sun exposure. So thinking we can reap the benefits of full spectrum light in a synthetic pill is something to ponder. So I definitely recommend you listen to this discussion with an open mind as Zaid goes deep into the research on all things sun avoidance, artificial light and skin cancer. Alrighty. Hi everyone. Welcome back to today's episode. I'm really looking forward to a conversation with Zaid Dahhaj, who was actually a previous guest on our episode, which was episode 112, where we chatted all things about the lost art of heliotherapy or sun therapy. Now, that episode was jam-packed with golden nuggets. So if you haven't already watched it, I strongly recommend you go back and to tuning into that one. So yeah, welcome back, Zaid.
Thank you. I'm excited to be on again and dive into a deeper discussion on sunlight and skin cancer and whatnot, whatever we have to cover.
Yeah, brilliant, excellent. So yeah, let's dive straight into this conversation because I think skin cancer, I feel it's particularly when we what we discussed in episode, that there is way more to this story, that many people, including shift workers, are either lathering up with sunblock or shunning the sun completely because of they're not aware of the benefits of heliotherapy or sun therapy, which could potentially be doing more harm than good. So my just an introductory thought here is that if sunshine is so bad for us, which we're kind of being led out to believe from certain government organisations, why then is every health complaint usually associated with low vitamin D?
Well, I think going back to the incentive structure that centralized medicine has and that it's essentially built off of is a huge problem, because you have various professionals, especially, within the dermatology industry, that basically say that you should avoid the sun altogether because of various things like skin cancer, aging, wrinkles, whatnot, whatever they want to focus on. But in reality, if you look at vitamin D3 as a foundational hormone, it acts more like a hormone instead of even though it's called a vitamin. I think that it has huge implications for avoiding chronic disease, everything from rickets to skin cancer, which we'll get into, to all sorts of autoimmune conditions, fibromyalgia. I mean, you could talk about every single thing as it relates to vitamin D3. But yeah, I just think that the incentive structure goes against all of these things that we're talking about in regards to circadian biology. It doesn't take any of it into consideration, really.
Yeah. And yeah, if we're lacking that sunlight, it's certainly messing with our circadian clocks, further disrupting that timing mechanism, which can't be good, especially for shift workers who already have a disrupted body clock. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a huge part of the discussion. Not many people focus on the circadian clocks, the foundational one, the central one being the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain. And then as a result of that getting activated by light, then it transitions into all of the peripheral clocks involved that are linked to every cell and organ in the body. One example that I've recently covered is actually how scientists or researchers found that exposing mice to late night meals actually altered their circadian skin clock to the point where it made them more susceptible to UV and burning. Now, I don't know if this translates exactly into human beings because the mechanisms are different. I mean, mice are nocturnal animals, human beings are diurnal. And so I think there's a little bit of truth to that. And it goes to show the complexity of the human body. If you mess with one thing, especially in relation to circadian biology, then everything else downstream is negatively affected by that. And I think in big ways, especially over time.
Yeah. That's a mind-boggling study, isn't it? And as you said, I know that it's a mice study, but the ramifications of that, like who would have thought there's some kind of a connection there with that food timing and the skin?
Yeah. I mean, it's systems thinking. People need to understand the basics of systems thinking, which is, I mean, it's built upon the foundation that everything is interconnected. So again, like what happens in the brain is not divorced from what happens in the kidneys or, pick your organs. I mean, all of it's interconnected. So it's all in constant communication. And whatever you do, whatever lifestyle choices you make will end up impacting the entire body as a whole. And this strikes at the heart of basically a subject known as holism instead of reductionism. And that's something we can explore in regards to centralized medicine versus decentralized. But we need to really embody holism at its finest.
Yeah, definitely. And so I guess we have to appreciate that not all light is equal. So it's not the same wavelength or it's not the same frequency. Could you run through some of the different spectrums and frequency of light, like the time that we see them and some of the benefits? Because we're not just talking about midday sun here. A lot of people will just think sun, skin cancer, being out in the middle of the day. Are you able just to guide us through the different light frequencies and times of day?
Yeah, so if we look at the nanometer length, which is basically, I mean, it's the length at which we measure sunlight or light wavelength specifically, you'll find that the sun goes anywhere between, I mean, it's an entire broad range, anywhere between around 2 nanometers to around 3,000 nanometers. So there is quite a large range involved, and it covers everything from UVA, UVB, UVC doesn't make it through the atmosphere. Then we have the red light spectrum covering near infrared light all the way to far infrared. And then you have various things like violet, green. Basically, like if you think about the entire rainbow, that's kind of the visual I want people to have in their mind. And then in regards to how the day is set up, the morning time is really when you see a lot of the red light spectrum at play because of the way that the sun is interacting with the atmosphere. Essentially, the light comes in at a certain angle to where green and blue and other wavelengths are scattered, and it just focuses on the red light spectrum. So a lot of people hear of red light therapy. That is like the prime time for red light therapy. It's the original red light therapy. And then when you head into the midday, that's when UV starts to peak, and that's where we see a lot of the biological benefits involved with UVA, UVB. And then towards the evening time, it's kind of the same as the morning where you get more of a red light therapy effect. But basically, that's the entire spectrum to where you have the beginning point at sunrise, and then all the way until sunset, and then you have total darkness. So it's the light and dark cycle at play.
So here in Australia, and I don't know if it's similar, well, I'm going to assume that it's very similar in the US, we've really been told we've got this slip, slop, slap campaign where we've got to wear a hat and put lots of sunblock on and stay out of the sun between 10 and 3, which obviously that's where all the UV rays are. So if we're not if it's not all bad, what is so good about being out in those times?
Well, again, going back to the UV spectrum, I mean, we need to understand that UV light is not a toxin. It's not to be demonized. I think that's where centralized medicine has it completely wrong, because if you study enough of this work at a deep enough level, if you study the work of, let's say, Professor Fritz Popp or Dr. Alexander Gurwitch, you'll find some very interesting things around biophysics and light that pique your interest. And it goes completely against the centralized narrative that's involving UV light being a toxin. One example of that is that every aspect of our body, every cell and tissue, emits very low frequency biophotons. So in other words, very low frequency UV light. So if UV light from the sun is a toxin, why is it that we find that every aspect of our body is actually producing UV light? It just doesn't make any sense, especially when you consider the evolutionary perspective, the circadian perspective. And so I think there's a lot of nuance involved that centralized medicine is not picking up on. And if you want to talk about UVA, like we mentioned in the last episode, nitric oxide production, UVB is where vitamin D3 actually gets produced. So if you're wearing sunscreen, which blocks UVA and UVB, you're not getting any of those benefits at all.
Yeah, it's definitely something to ponder, isn't it? And then, of course, there is that whole opens the door for the supplement industry, the vitamin, D supplement industry, which is pretty huge. And I agree, something never sat well with me, knowing that it's actually a vitamin like melatonin. Like, are we meant to be really supplementing? Can you really get sunlight in a pill? So yeah, but anyway, before we get into that study, and which I'm sure that you've seen as well, that was a Swedish study that was published in the Journal of Internal Medicine, and it showed the avoidance of sun was actually a risk factor for major causes of death. I've just got it here, and I'll just reading through that. It also showed that non-smokers who avoided sun exposure had a life expectancy similar to smokers in the highest sun exposure group, indicating that avoidance of sun exposure is a risk factor for the death of a magnitude similar to smoking. I mean, wow. I know that's not Australia and I know it's not the US, but we can't just, that's massive. Its results.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely shocking, especially when I bring that study up to a lot of people who aren't aware of this sort of realm. Their jaw drops to the floor. They're like, that can't possibly be, especially considering that centralized medicine and dermatology and the cosmetic industry is telling me to avoid the sun. So again, going back to the evolutionary biology, circadian biology, this is just how we evolved as a species. And so it's not absurd at all. As a matter of fact, I think the longer we go with the scientific narrative, the longer we study these things, I think we'll come out with even more shocking outcomes in terms of the results that we're seeing in scientific data.
Yeah, I agree. I think it seems to be a lot of stuff that's sort of been a bit hidden from us. Obviously, creates that different worldview. So, if the sun is not causing skin cancer, what is?
That's the big question. From my research so far, I honestly think that it is number one, sun avoidance, for the reasons that you are not producing vitamin D3, which is a potent anti-cancer compound. You're also not producing melatonin, which is another potent anti-cancer compound via the mitochondria, so subcellular form of melatonin that is stimulated from near-infrared light from the sun. So sun avoidance. And then I think we need to consider the fact that being under artificial light, which is inherently toxic to human biology and in all biological systems, is a big consideration that accelerates the development of melanoma, basal cell carcinoma, various skin cancers, and really all cancer as well. And there's actually quite a few studies that I can bring up, like honestly right now, that go to show the strong link between artificial light at night and the formation of many different cancers. And it's not an associative connection as well. It's not just correlation. It's actually causation, which is the mind-blowing thing. So basically staying inside for most of the day, using sunscreen, using sunglasses, being fed this fear narrative around the sun in combination with the lighting system that we have indoors. I think that's really the kicker to all of this skin cancer discussion here.
Yeah. And so obviously we are burning because we haven't had, I guess, any sort of sun exposure as well, because obviously there's always going to be that as you said, the nuances. And we're talking about, say, sun exposure here, not going out and, maybe just frying yourself after being stuck indoors for so long. That certainly makes sense, because so many of us are indoors now, aren't we? Especially, like, I'll use our audience as an example, that are maybe in call centres under those very, very toxic LED lights. Ironically, the hospital, I was actually having a similar conversation to another guest, that the hospital environment really is not set up for conducive for health and well-being in that regard. That we were talking about food, but also the light. So do you think also that's obviously playing a role? We're spending so much time, and then we might go out on the weekend on our days off and expose the body to, like, a bit of a shock exposure to the skin, sun?
I honestly think everything plays a role, from nutrition to lack of sleep. But if we're talking about the biggest factor involved, I think not, practicing sun avoidance and then being under artificial light most of the time, I mean, basically 24/7 for people today is really the main cause. And we need to consider, I've heard from Dr. Jack Kruse that sunburn is actually not associated with any form of skin cancer in the literature. That's something that I need to confirm, but coming from Kruse, I think that he's done a lot of his homework and he's one of the leaders in the space. So I'm willing to trust him on that end. But again, I'm going to confirm that soon. And then when you consider that people are not producing vitamin D3, they're chronically deficient for most of their lives. And then on one hand, you're not getting melatonin from near infrared light from the sun, plus the melatonin that's stimulated from the pineal gland after sunset, which is destroyed by artificial blue light. Then you can see how people are beginning to set themselves up for skin cancer, especially all other forms of cancer. But for me, I think it's just a complete circadian dysfunction that's achieved chronically over time. And then that's not even to bring in the discussion of non-native EMF, which is a huge problem when it comes to cellular health.
Yeah, completely, messing with them again. So getting back to the nutrition side of things, obviously timing, you touched on a study about the timing. What do you think might be contributing from the actual food content? Like, because obviously reports of skin cancer has risen quite a lot if we were, to sit back and look at the graphs when all the processed foods kind of came into play. Can you share some of the research that you've sort of come across in correlation to the food and the skin incidence of skin cancer?
I'm not so much concerned about the food per se. I think it's the effect that the food has on the body. So if you're talking about processed junk food, you'll find it, I mean, basically on every corner, wherever you are, whatever country you're in, that causes increased inflammation in the body. And, inflammation is not the bad guy per se, but it's chronic inflammation that is the negative thing here in this discussion. If people are constantly chronically inflaming their body, I think that's going to be a contributing factor to skin cancer and all other forms of cancer. And then we have to consider that every cell in our body is actually made from a layer of fat. And so if we're consuming things like vegetable oils, which are already oxidized before we consume them, that actually gets integrated into our fat cells, as opposed to things like healthy fats, like monounsaturated fats, saturated. Those sources are healthy for the body. But vegetable oils automatically increase the likelihood that you have chronic inflammation, is dysfunctional by default, because our body intakes the fat that we eat, and then it makes up our cells with that fat. So I think that's a big consideration that not many people focus on. And then, I think at the core of it, it's just increased chronic inflammation. And then that will translate into the integrity of the skin and how it responds to UV light, which I do view as a stressor. But again, there's a lot of nuance involved. I think ultimately having a very comprehensive framework around this stuff is important.
Yeah. And again, I was talking to somebody about the seed oils, obviously, that, that's playing a huge role in that inflammatory equation. And he even sort of said, well, I don't even think of the seed oils as food because they're not in that nutrition category. And I thought, I like that. That's so true. But we assume it's food because it's in our pantries.
Yeah, it's industrial lubricant. I mean, quite literally, that's what it's used for. It's used to power machines and cars.
Yeah, so it ain't food, even though it's in the supermarket. Yeah, and most people aren't aware of that. So obviously there's way better, choices of oils, avocado, your olives and coconut oils and things like that, as opposed to the seed oils. All right. Can we touch
And by the way,
on?
sorry to interrupt. I do want to mention one thing actually in relation to vitamin D3. So it's kind of a segue.
Yep.
But if we look at what vitamin D3 does in the body, it actually produces these little things called autophagosomes, which actually are responsible for taking cancerous or potentially cancerous, otherwise known as senescent cells, and then running that through the process of autophagy, which is basically like the recycling system of the body. So if you don't have enough vitamin D3 because you're not sunbathing, then you're not producing those things to then get rid of cancerous cells. So that's another part of the discussion with skin cancer and other forms of cancer.
Yeah, wow. Wow. And we know those the test for vitamin D is really just a proxy for for sun exposure. It's kind of crazy that we think that we can supplement our way. That this little tiny pule has the same benefits from full spectrum sun.
Yeah. Yeah, no, the two are, I mean, they couldn't be any different. If you look at the way that each are transported in the body, vitamin D3 from sunlight on the skin compared to vitamin D pills, they go through completely different transport routes. And so you can kind
Wow.
of think of vitamin D from a pill as like, quote unquote, unaddressed mail. It gets into the body, but it doesn't go exactly where it needs to be in the same way that if you didn't have someone's email and you wanted to send them an email, it's just not going to get to the destination. On the skin, that is addressed mail. It gets to exactly where it needs to be. And of course, knowing how complex the body is, that's a very important thing because the devil is in the details.
Mm. Yeah, wow, great analogy. The letterbox delivery system, that's, yeah, a great analogy. So let's talk about sunblock because that stuff, let's face it, when you look at the ingredients, when you actually take the time to study the ingredients, which is on some on some bottles, what's going on there?
I mean, they're just toxic ingredients. There's nothing more to it. I think that these are ingredients for the most part that don't belong on the skin. We know that the skin absorbs around 60 to 70% of what you put onto it. So that stuff is getting into your system. A lot of these ingredients are xenoestrogens. They mess with your hormones. They just cause dysfunction in a very complex system that operates on the quantum level. So I think that's a part of it, but it's actually not my concern. I'm not really concerned about the ingredients per se. I'm more concerned about the fact that sunscreen artificially manipulates the full light spectrum in harmful ways. So again, like I mentioned, the blocking of UVA, the blocking of UVB, that's all very problematic. And that's going to lead to a situation where you have more atrophic skin. So essentially you have weak and dysfunctional skin because you're not exposing yourself to the right adaptation. You're actually messing with the entire process involving the light spectrum and how it's supposed to hit your skin. And I think one of the greatest ways or examples of that is just the fact that you're not producing vitamin D or melanin. And so you're leaving yourself wide open because you're not creating the stimulus for that protection.
Mm. So that's a great segue into, okay, so what is the body's natural sunscreen? And does it have it? And how can we stimulate it?
Yeah, the Mother Nature's natural sunscreen is melanin. So if you take a look at darker skinned people, they have more eumelanin, which is responsible for the blacks and browns. I think we actually covered this in the last episode too. Whereas lighter skinned people have more pheomelanin, responsible for the reds, yellows, oranges, pinks in nature. But either way, both forms of melanin are protective. Pheomelanin tends to be less protective than eumelanin, but either way, it still protects. And I want people to understand more melanin. So it's just about having the right framework around light, blocking artificial light after sunset, all of these things that we're talking about here.
Yeah. Yeah. So every now and then we do hear about people that develop these melanomas on their big toe or on an area that's never exposed to sunlight. Can you explain the mechanisms behind that? What that might be?
Yeah, so my hunch is that, again, going back to the chronically deficient vitamin D3, because the body does not have enough of the protection, so to speak, against these senescent cells, which are basically precancerous cells, the body can't clear away these cells. And as a result, over time, as you practice more sun avoidance, as you experience more of life under artificial blue light, your likelihood of developing cancer goes through the roof, especially skin cancer. And what's particularly nasty is that a lot of dermatology does not even mention the fact that most of the melanoma cases take place in areas of the skin that aren't exposed to sunlight. So how about that for a mind blow? It's melanoma. Why is it that we're seeing melanoma patients basically developing melanoma in areas that aren't exposed to sunlight? It makes no sense logically. And so that's something I want people to consider. It's also a very interesting thing. Another stat for you is that indoor workers are more likely to develop melanoma than outdoor workers. Again, going back to the vitamin D, the artificial light, all of this stuff is interconnected. And I think I actually have a study here as well. It's called, I wanted to bring this up, so I had it ready. So
Yeah.
the use of sunscreen and risk of melanoma and non-melanoma skin cancer. It's a systematic review and meta-analysis done in 20. And the last line is very interesting. We don't have to go into the details, but the last line is very interesting. It says, while the current evidence suggests no increased risk of skin cancer related to sunscreen use, the systematic review does not confirm the expected protective benefits of sunscreen against skin cancer in the general population. So even people who are using sunscreen are not even being protected by that sunscreen because it's just not panning out as centralized medicine says.
Which makes you wonder what is it really doing then?
I think it's just making companies money.
Well, yeah, of course, yeah. I mean, the sunblock industry is massive, as is the vitamin industry massive. But I guess it's also adding a lot of burden onto the liver and the whole, detoxification system, isn't it? Which can interfere with the whole body's whole biochemistry.
Yeah, and a few other things. Nobody talks about how since around the early 1900s, melanoma rates have been skyrocketing, but people's avoidance of the sun is at an all-time high. So people are listening to centralized authorities and doing exactly what they want them to do, yet melanoma rates are through the roof.
Yeah.
So I think that's a little bit of truth or a red pill that people are not willing to swallow.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So then what are your thoughts on, because I'm always thinking about our listeners that might be, in Alaska and North America and places that don't have the luxury that we do with the sun exposure, and they might be using things like SAD lamps. What are your thoughts on those? Are they beneficial or could they be making things worse? If so, is there an alternative for them?
You know what? I'll get controversial here. I actually do think that SAD lamps and these other forms of artificial light, I mean, those are the key words, artificial light, are more damaging to human health than beneficial. Especially in areas that are darker, like Alaska. I think that what people need to really do is to remove all of these artificial light sources that are isolating either UV or blue light and just simply get outside more. I mean, if you take a look at cloud cover or really rainy conditions, dark winters, you still have an incredible amount of light available outside. So if people can just get outside instead of using these artificial light sources, that's going to have huge returns in the long run.
So it's not just about sunlight exposure. We're talking about light, full spectrum light exposure.
Exactly. And those are the key words, full spectrum. So when we start to get into, spurty lamps and vitamin D producing lamps, it's only really targeting it's only focused on a very isolated form of the wavelength. So UVB in the case of spurty lamps, but there's no red, there's no violet, there's no green. It needs to be packaged in the full light spectrum, especially blue in relation to red.
And you can't get blue, red, yellow, all that kind of stuff in that little pill, either.
No, you can't.
Let's face it. So, okay, well, that's good tips just to be getting outside. But then my immediate thought is, hang on, we've got so many clothes on. We've got the beanies, the big, jackets and stuff like that. Are we still getting any benefit?
So it depends on where you live. If we're talking about a place like New Zealand or Southern California, you are getting the benefit from the perspective of red and near-infrared light, more specifically near-infrared, because that can actually penetrate clothing. But when it comes to blocking UVA and UVB, it's basically like another form of sunscreen. So that is why I give the recommendation of exposing most of your skin to the sun, even if it's a little bit cold. I mean, there's obviously nuance here, and there's a point to which you can't do that. But even if it's a little bit cold, I think it's good for people to get out of the air-conditioned environments that we're in 24/7 in order to develop some of those adaptations that would benefit health. Like the research on cold thermogenesis is incredible, and not many people are focused on it.
Yeah, because that's a good stress, that hormetic stress, isn't it?
Yeah. So basically I'm just advocating more skin in the game, get your eyes in the game, Anything that blocks your skin or eyes is going to be problematic over the long run. And you don't have to be perfect, but just progress into a better situation to where you're getting more of those organs exposed.
Is it possible that, depending on where we are born, that even if we are able to, again, I'm going to be thinking of our Alaskan friends or our Northern Americans here, that because of their reduced light exposure, is it possible that we can kind of bank our light benefit? So for 4 or 5 months, we're able to, get out as much as we can, and then it's sort of stored so that it can last us through the winter. Is there any research that indicates that there's something to that?
Yeah, so vitamin D3 specifically can be stored in the body fat. The only problem I see is that if somebody lives in Alaska or a dark environment, which, I mean, if it's dark for most of the year, then somebody is not going to be able to produce the vitamin D3 needed, which will be stored for darker months. So it's kind of like, you need to travel and go vacation for a couple weeks to a month in order to develop these practices and gain enough vitamin D3 so that you can have more leverage during the winter. Because when we head into wintertime, almost nobody thinks about the relationship between melatonin and vitamin D3. Melatonin is actually tied to the vitamin D receptor. So once we head into winter, we have enough vitamin D3 stored, we can use things like melatonin to then tap into our vitamin D3 stores in the body fat. And even cold, even if you lose body fat through cold exposure, ice baths, that will be released into your system as well.
Wow. Okay. That's interesting. Yeah. That's really interesting. So so let's forget about the SAD lamps. The red light therapy, though, there's something to that, isn't there?
There is, but I have my concerns around red light therapy panels because, again, the whole non-native EMF discussion, I think it depends on the panel, but I would honestly try to avoid it as much as possible because non-native EMF also has a detrimental impact on melatonin and vitamin D and all of these other metrics that we focus on.
Yeah, so it might be helping for some in one thing, but destroying the mechanisms on the other. So yeah, kind of wipes out the benefits. That's what you're insinuating?
I mean, kind of, you still will get benefit from the red and near infrared light. I would much rather have people go for something like a fireplace, candlelight. I mean, candlelight's not going to be as powerful, but if somebody has a fireplace and they can get that firelight exposed to most of their skin, that's a form of red light therapy that I would definitely stand by with no negative downsides.
It's just getting back to nature as much as we possibly can, isn't it? Yeah, it really is.
Again, we're circadian creatures and we evolved in a specific situation or environment for hundreds of thousands of years, so it only makes sense.
Yeah. All right. So I'm sure we've got some people listening that may be starting to question what we've been told and the benefits of it. If we've got somebody maybe that's quite fair or redheaded and they want to naturally start to boost their vitamin D3 and because of the whole benefits, it's not just about vitamin D. What direction would you tell them to start? How do they actually go about this?
So I wrote a Substack article called The Solar Callus Guide, and it basically covers everything from A to Z around this, especially for lighter skinned people, because that is the demographic that is at highest risk of burning. So we want to be careful. We want to be nuanced. We want to have intention when it comes to this process. As I mentioned in the last episode, I think focusing on the morning sunlight is going to be the most important thing. So getting most of the skin exposed to morning sunlight anywhere between sunrise and 8 to 9 a.m. because that's going to prime your skin for the high UV conditions. So once you have that down as your routine, I think it's wise to start playing around with midday sunlight exposure. And for lighter skinned people, honestly, start at 5 minutes. Super small, super simple, most of the skin exposed, no sunglasses, no contacts. That's going to be the move. And then over time, you want to progressively increase the amount of time you spend during midday. So you go from 5 minutes, 10 minutes. If you need to do that every week and a half or so, by all means, as long as you're staircasing yourself towards more exposure, that's going to be key. And then on the other hand, thinking about the light and dark cycle, we want to block artificial light religiously. I honestly think that this is one of the more important things because if we take a look at the skin, it actually contains light sensing proteins. And we know that artificial light in and of itself actually destroys the integrity of the skin. So if you don't block artificial light, then you're going to leave the door wide open for the potential of burning as well. So it's really aligning ourselves with the light and dark cycle to make sure that our body works as it's supposed to.
It's very brain mental gymnastics trying to comprehend that we have photoreceptors in our skin, isn't it?
Yeah. Even the bigger guys don't know about this. Like even the Hubermans of the world, the the Rob
Really?
Wolfs of the world, they actually don't know about light sensing proteins or non-visual photoreceptors.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. Okay. Yeah, because they're
Yeah,
certainly
it's crazy. And by the way, it just goes to show like all of these ivory tower places of education like Stanford or Harvard, sometimes they'll have it in the literature, but the education is not disseminated to the people who are learning about this stuff. Like, I mean, you could have a professor at Stanford, great, he knows a lot of things. He could even be a neurosurgeon or a dermatologist, but again, they're just not being taught everything in its full scope. And that I think really translates into how much propaganda there is in the conventional system around education.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about just, I think, having an open mind and just starting to question things a little bit more that don't really make sense. And I guess following that monetary path, as you were alluded to right at the beginning, that there are other vested interests, not necessarily for our health and well-being, which is a sad kind of situation. So, is there anything else that I may have not covered question-wise, that you think that our listeners would benefit from, just to help them? Because this is big. It is a big conversation, and if you're hearing it for the first time, that the sun is not necessarily the chief cause of skin cancer, what do you recommend to our listeners?
I think having an open mind, being skeptical is inherently valuable here, as opposed to the other option of just taking anything that you hear from quote unquote authorities as gospel. I think that's key. And then dig through the literature. I mean, I am working on exposing a lot of these studies in terms of like getting it out there to the masses. But it's pretty shocking when you actually go through the scientific literature and find that artificial light is linked to cancer, linked to obesity, linked to neurodegeneration, every single chronic ailment that you can think of. And then on the other hand, when you dig into the research on melanoma and quote unquote sunlight causing skin cancer, you'll actually find that every study done has been done on nocturnal mice. Many times they're albino nocturnal mice, which is even crazier to me because they are, of course, going to burn and develop melanoma. And then a lot of these studies, actually all of these studies, use isolated forms of UVA and UVB without any of the red, without any of the violet, any of the other light wavelengths that we need in the full light spectrum. So you can toss every single study in the trash that basically says that sunlight causes cancer because they haven't studied the sun. They've studied UVA and UVB in isolation.
Wow, that's profound.
Yep.
I wasn't aware of that. Yeah. Wow. It's cherry picking, isn't it? It's cherry picking the data to bring out the result that you're wanting.
I wouldn't even consider it cherry picking. I think there's a bigger problem at play. It's just reductionism. Like these people don't understand the sun comes with an entire spectrum of light. Like it's not just UVA and UVB that you're dealing with. We need to understand that blue is always paired with red. Violet is always paired with green. I mean, this is just, it's first principles thinking. And I don't think the scientific community has that in their minds, which is a shame.
Yeah. One other thing that a question I just thought of just then is here in Australia again, and I'm sure it's certainly something that it's a lot of people do over in California. We get up, we go for our walk in the morning, and the sun's up. So we're grabbing those sunglasses. How can we, I don't want to use the word convince, but encourage people that that's actually not doing you a favor and it's potentially, causing you to burn later on in the day, maybe not necessarily there and then, but later on in the day?
I will admit it's tough. Some people like the scientific explanation. I mean, I could talk about how sunglasses block the UV light input into the eye, which then stimulates the POMC system to then create alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone, which melanocytes create melanin. That gets through to some people. But I think a large part of this work is speaking to the general population who uses sunglasses for the most part. I think some very simple explanations, but mostly testimonials. If I can show people that other people have achieved success with this method, then I think people are going to be more open-minded, because I don't think many people are willing to listen to the scientific explanation. It's kind of one of those tough things that you have to navigate.
So what sort of testimonials have you had when you're telling your clients to not use the sunglasses?
Well, some very simple things like, if I can show somebody who isn't aware of any of these subjects that I can take somebody who's been burning, somebody who's been using sunglasses, and then after we remove sunglasses from the equation and we don't change anything else, they notice that their skin tolerance to UV light is higher. I think that's a pretty straightforward example. Like the mere addition of sunglasses is causing your burning. And when you remove them from the equation, then you don't burn. There are a lot of people that I've come across that have told me that exact thing. So I think that's one good example that I can give. And then the whole concept of people having sensitive eyes. I don't believe in that concept. I actually think that people have quote unquote sensitive eyes because they're always wearing sunglasses, because they're blocking the full light spectrum. So they're not adapting to that level of brightness that's provided from the sun.
Yeah, that's it. That's a good point. I was actually having a similar conversation to somebody about it. They're saying, "No, there's no way I could drive without wearing my sunglasses because it's too glary and I can't see." And I'm thinking, I used to be like that, but now it's like, no, I don't need them. I don't need them. But obviously, it does. It takes an adjustment.
Yeah, it definitely takes an adjustment. And a lot of people find that their sensitivity to sunlight just completely goes away from the ocular perspective. But I think sunglasses are, for the most part, they're useless. They're actually detrimental to human biology. But, if we're talking about the sun being exactly in your path when you're driving and you really can't see, I don't see any problem with wearing sunglasses for like 5-10 minutes. It's whatever.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about the practical things into your day-to-day activity. And it just got me thinking too about this building this used to be exposed to the sun. Even if people are on or being outside, for the night shifters that are working in that call centre, are they getting any benefit from taking regular breaks outside, even if they're standing under the moonlight? Is there anything to that?
Under moonlight specific, that's a good question. I have no idea, to be honest. Like, I would like to say that there's some light wavelength coming off of the moon that's benefiting people, but I really don't know.
Yeah.
It's a tough situation. I think with night shift workers and people who are indoors most of the time, I think protecting yourself from artificial light is the key, and really taking sun breaks, it goes a long way. So if you can take one sun break every 20-25 minutes, that I think is going to be the difference between somebody who crosses over from borderline healthy to like full disease state. Like, I really do think the details matter here, and what you do every single day adds up over time. So those are just some things that come to mind, but I will have to study moonlight. I know moonlight doesn't disrupt the circadian rhythm, but I don't know of any other benefits associated with it.
But I suppose if we flick it to the day perspective, again, that call center that's stuck indoors all day, and they may not be able to do it quite that regularly, even if it's 3 times during their 12-hour shift, if they can get themselves outside. I know it's not the ideal situation, but it's better than nothing. And I think it's potentially also reminding that circadian timing system, hang on, it is daytime. I know you're stuck indoors under artificial light and your body thinks it's night, but by going outside at least as much as possible, it's sending them that signal to say it's daylight. We need to keep your metabolism going, your digestive system going, and everything else. I think that's all got to help, surely.
Yeah, most definitely. It goes a long way to help the human body and whatnot. I will drop a little bit of a red pill here that a lot of people don't want to hear, but if you are experiencing some sort of mitochondrial disease, there's no chance that you can afford to spend your time doing that kind of work. There's absolutely no chance. Like, you have to literally either move out of the country and do something outside, or find a job that inherently means you are outside and getting more of that full light exposure. Because being under artificial light during the day is also a huge problem, not only the night, but also during the day.
And what does that look like when you're referring to mitochondrial disease?
So if you study the work of Dr. Doug Wallace, he's like the premier mitochondrial researcher in the world. He will outright say that basically upwards of 80 to 90% of all disease is a mitochondrial disease. So everything from Parkinson's to type 2 diabetes to obesity, pick your disease, it's likely going to be at the root a mitochondrial dysfunction. And so when you think about what people are dealing with for the most part in society, I mean, almost everyone has some form of chronic condition. It's only like the biggest difference is like to what degree do you have that condition? If you have it to a really bad degree, then you can't afford to work inside under artificial light or avoid the sun. You just can't.
Yeah. And again, I appreciate your upfront honesty. We need to keep it real as much as I do this podcast to help educate people to be as healthy as they possibly can whilst working shift work. We know that you're never going to ever really thrive. Some people say you can thrive whilst working shift work. I don't. I'm a realist. I think it is all about survival because we're not doing the thing that we should be doing. But if there is that point where your health, maybe you've been doing it a long time and your health really is starting to suffer, and even worse, if you definitely hate your job, I think then it's time to change. If you love your job, that makes it a bit more difficult because there are a lot of people out there that absolutely love their job. I know I did for a very long time, but there comes a point where you do have to weigh things and make the tough decisions. But at the end of the day, we've only got one body, one earth suit to take care of it.
Yeah. And especially with shift workers, I think that, I don't have too much experience around shift workers, but I feel like many of them potentially feel like it's a long-term, lifelong type of thing. Whereas, it can be a short-term thing. Like it doesn't have to be your entire career. Like you can start shift for maybe a year or two and then transition to other things within the medical field. But yeah, it's just one of those huge problems that's inherent to, I guess, centralized medicine that we should try to just work best with and remediate, really.
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose the penalties are a big luring draw card for a lot of people from a financial perspective. That keeps people in. And yeah, there's a police force, the medical, my industry, aviation. Once you kind of get into it, you do tend to stay in it for long term. Gosh, I remember interviewing a guy that was a train driver for over 50 years. No, he wasn't 50. He was a train driver for over 50 years, but he loved it. And yeah, so I guess that also can help with your health, if you are generally enjoying it. But yeah, anyway, this has been a really great chat again, Zaid. I do appreciate your scientific spin on things. Because I know that you certainly dive very deeply to understand the mechanisms and the science behind all of this. It's not just purely anecdotal. So I do, I really appreciate you coming on again and chatting about this kind of controversial topic. But I think it's important that we at least have an open discussion. And at the end of the day, it's up to people what they want to decide that they want to do with it.
Yeah, thank you again for a wonderful conversation. I think that if people are willing to open their minds and have more conversations around these things, it's only going to enhance our relationship with not only each other, but also with sunlight and various things around the topic. So again, I'm very grateful for having you put me on this platform. So love it.
Yep. Terrific. All right. Well, that's it for another episode of the Healthy Shift Worker podcast. If you want to learn a little bit more about Zaid, I'll put the same show notes that I did on his previous episode. So you're able to get in contact with him to maybe work with him or learn a little bit more about what he's doing. So yeah, thank you again for joining. Please share this episode if you feel that it is insightful and that you believe that there are other people that can get the Healthy Shift Worker message far and wide. Until next time, we'll see you then.